Everybody, welcome. We're just letting folks connect, getting folks out of the waiting room into here, but we'll get going soon so we can get underway and we'll see how efficiently we can get through a whole bunch of information and conversation with you all today. I still see a couple. Hello from Albert. Great, we'll just give it about 30 more seconds and then I can start with a little welcome, and that will give some more people time to get on before we get into the meat of the policy discussion. Oh, and if everybody could please mute yourself, that would be great. Thank you. See a few others not muted. Greta, are we slowing down from the waiting room?
Yes, we are.
Excellent, excellent. So let's go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome everyone to our Climate and Energy Legislative Landscape webinar. It's really great to be with you all and happy 2023. My name is Lauren Hurl and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters, and VCV is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to advocate for strong environmental laws, hold lawmakers accountable, and help elect environmental allies. And I'm really delighted to be joined by a fabulous panel of experts to discuss some of the top climate and energy bills that we're likely to see in play in the 2023 legislative session. And before I turn it over to my colleagues, I wanted to share a really brief lay of the land as we enter the second week of a new legislative session. So first of all, as you know, I just think it's worth mentioning that we are operating in the context that Vermont has adopted the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2020. So that means we now have mandatory greenhouse gas pollution reduction targets. So the policies we're discussing today are all important components of how we meet those targets and how we ensure a just transition to a clean energy future. In terms of what to expect in the legislature this year, I wanted to share a few updates of the landscape. So as you all know, last year we saw a huge number of retirements, which did make us a little nervous about what to expect coming in this year. But we were really pleased to see a great group of new folks run for the legislature. And we had some great returning champs. Climate ended up being a key election issue, and thanks in part to a lot of hard work by the environmental community, climate allies overwhelmingly won their races across the state. So now coming into 2023, as you all know, the legislature convened last week and lawmakers were sworn in. The House reelected Speaker Jill Krowinski to serve in that role, but we do have a new Senate President Pro Tem Phil Baruth. Committee jurisdictions and assignments were announced last week. There are a lot of new chairs and new committee makeups, given there's so many new folks overall. The Senate is structurally the same, and for the main committees where we focus and where the policies that we'll be talking about today spend most of their time, we still have Chair Christopher Bray in the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee, and the money committees where these bills tend to go have the same chairs, Senators Ann Cummings and Jane Kitchell. There's two new members of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee, Senators Ann Watson and Becca White. And so those are going to be, I think, some great new allies on that committee. And of course, you know, with all new people, they'll need some time to get up to speed on the issues and to, you know, being new senators. On the House side, it was a little different. They restructured two of our key committees and essentially combined the Energy and Technology Committee and the Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee into what is now going to be called the Environment and Energy Committee. So Representative Amy Sheldon will be chairing that, and there's a mix of folks from the Energy and the Natural Resources committees, along with a couple new legislators. So I think, you know, from my perspective, it looks overall like a strong committee, some great expertise and experience, but it is a really expansive range of jurisdiction. And I think, you know, that reality paired with the learning curve of new members and a really new committee learning to work together, you know, I think things might be a little slower overall than we might have hoped. And so it's really going to be on us to keep working to educate and engage and pushing for, strong action on the climate policies that we'll be discussing today. The last thing I wanted to note was that there is a climate solutions caucus of legislators that's been growing over the past number of years. They met this week and almost 50 lawmakers showed up, and it had a bunch of enthusiastic new members and a lot of really excited returning members. So I think it's really exciting and encouraging to see, people who represented every committee in the legislature that were there ready to, push for strong climate action. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we're seeing so far. And logistically, again, please stay on mute and please put comments and questions in the chat. And we're going to go through the presentations, but we've got a lot of time. So we'll get to as many of your questions as we can at the end. And, including if you have any about kind of the lay of the land, feel free to add those in and we'll try to get to some of those as well. So now I'm going to introduce the speakers and turn it over so we can get into the meat of this conversation. So first we're going to hear from Chase Whiting, who will discuss the Affordable Heat Act. He is an attorney at Conservation Law Foundation, where he engages in litigation and advocacy to transition New England to clean energy and transportation. We're then going to hear from Ben Edgerly Walsh, who will discuss updates to the Renewable Energy Standard to ensure it's 100% renewable and that it requires we build far more new renewables. Ben is the Climate and Energy Program Director for VPIRG. He lives in Winooski and has been leading VPIRG's climate work for the past decade. After that, we'll hear from Rob Kidd, who will be discussing clean transportation. Rob is the Sierra Club's Vermont Conservation Program Manager, and his priority campaign work is addressing transportation's impact on climate change, in addition to general environmental conservation. And then we'll wrap with Debbie New and Jim Dumont, who are going to tag team. And Debbie New will discuss networked geothermal. She coordinates the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance and works with a network action team focused on implementing network geothermal energy in Vermont. And finally, Jim Dumont, who will help discuss the Ratepayer Protection Act. He has been representing citizen groups and individual citizens in environmental and energy matters in the courts and before administrative agencies since 1980. So welcome to all of you. Thank you to the panel, and thank you all so much for tuning in today to learn more about some of these key climate and energy policies. And I'm going to turn it over now to Chase.
Thanks, Lauren, and hello, everybody. It's great to see all of your faces, and it's great to have you here. So, as Lauren said, my name is Chase Whiting. I am with Conservation Law Foundation. I work on the clean energy and climate change team there, and I work on projects across New England, but I live and work here in Vermont, so I have a particular focus on Vermont climate policy and law. Full disclosure, I have a newborn at home, and I have not had time to create spiffy slides. Instead, I am going to speak a little bit, but I'll try to keep it succinct and snappy so as not to lose everybody's attention. So as you all know, Vermont's thermal sector, by which we mean how we heat buildings primarily, there's some other things in there, but that's the big chunk of it. It is one of Vermont's, if not Vermont's, largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, sort of depending on how you count those emissions. And so reducing emissions in the thermal space in Vermont is critical for Vermont to achieve its greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, which, as Lauren said, are set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So it's one of those key areas, something that we need to focus on in order to achieve the climate pollution reductions we need to see. So last year, there was a bill called the Clean Heat Standard, which was designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal space in Vermont. This year, a similar bill is going to be introduced called the Affordable Heat Act. And that's what I'm hoping to spend my time this morning talking about. So a well-designed thermal policy, like the Affordable Heat Act, is one that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions meaningfully, by at least the measures set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act that could increase the affordability for the ways that we heat and cool our buildings. And, you know, one, two, that could reduce toxic air pollution, types of things that we see resulting from burning dirty things like fossil fuels that we then all breathe and that impacts our health. So those are the sorts of metrics that I think any policy ought to be measured against, and that the Affordable Heat Act too should be measured against. You know, so drawing that towards sort of more concrete policy things, a well-designed policy is one that limits harmful heating sources, things that produce greenhouse gas emissions or toxic air pollution. It's also one that promotes beneficial heating sources, truly clean things, high efficiency electric heating, home weatherization, geothermal sources, things like that, things that don't require the production of new greenhouse gas emissions or toxic air pollutants. And also, you know, just things that to increase affordability, since those types of measures in the long run save folks a lot of money. Another thing that would be a priority, in addition to the first two things I mentioned, would be ensuring that an Affordable Heat Act accurately accounts greenhouse gas emissions. Since at the end of the day, we're in the business of stopping climate change, we need to make sure that the greenhouse gas emissions that we're targeting are being counted accurately, and that we're reducing emissions accurately. And so with those sort of three big things in mind, limiting the harmful things, promoting the good things, and making sure that we're counting the emissions accurately, I think that, you know, those are the sorts of core things that would go into making a really well-designed Affordable Heat Act. So this year's bill, a version of which is online now in Senate Natural Resources, has taken really important strides in all three of those areas. It takes steps to limit some of the harmful forms of heating and the harms such as greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution that can result from them. It takes big steps in terms of incentivizing clean forms of heating that will, in the long run, save folks money and reduce toxic air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And it helps to ensure more accurate and verifiable greenhouse gas emissions accounting. So the work is clearly not done. It never is. We always have ways to improve policies and to come up with better climate solutions, but major strides have been made. And the Affordable Heat Act that is being introduced this year certainly is checking a lot of the boxes. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Chase. And again, questions that you have, please put them in the chat and we will get to, we'll have plenty of time built in for Q&A at the end. So look forward to that discussion. So next I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk about renewable energy.
Thanks so much, Lauren and Chase. Let me share some slides here. Let's see. Sorry, one moment. Here we go. All right, can everyone see that? Or Lauren, can you see that? And I'll assume everyone else can.
Yes, it looks good. Thanks.
Great. So the second very high priority of the sort of coalition of organizations working on, actually, let me back up and introduce myself. Apologies. Ben Edgerly-Walsh, as Lauren said, with Vermont Public Interest Research Group. For folks who aren't familiar with VPIRG, we're the state's largest consumer protection and environmental advocacy organization. Climate change is and has for a long time been our top priority. We and I have worked for a long time on getting more renewable electricity built, made some real progress, have a lot of work left to do, as I'll talk about in a minute. So shifting into this policy, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the current law, the current statute that we have in Vermont, the Renewable Energy Standard that was passed in 2015, what that looks like, what are some of the sort of key gaps in it, a little bit more about renewable electricity and the sort of context of the electricity markets in New England, and then get into what we're going to be pushing for this legislative biennium. So the Renewable Energy Standard that was passed in 2015 has three big requirements. I'm going to be getting into the first two. I will briefly mention the third one, but it's not a sort of core focus at the moment. So we'll spend a little bit less time on it. So the first big requirement that this law has on the books is a requirement that Vermont's electric utilities by 2032 provide 75% of the electricity they're selling to Vermonters from renewables, renewable electricity that's deliverable to Vermont. 65% of that 75% can come from any renewable electricity anywhere in or near New England, old, new, large, small, any type of renewable source allowable under Vermont law. Mostly that's currently being met with older hydroelectric resources, both with sort of contracts for the power, and then some with renewable energy certificates or renewable energy credits. But that 65%, the sort of core thing to understand about it is, while we have contracts for renewables, that's actually not getting new renewable electricity built. It's contracts for renewables that have been, in most cases, been in existence for several or many decades. The second piece of that is what you might hear called Tier 2 of the Renewable Energy Standard. That's 10% by 2032 coming from newly built renewables up to 5 megawatts that are in the state of Vermont, connected to our transmission or distribution grid. That is the portion of this policy that gets new renewable electricity built. And that, when we're looking at that at VPIRG, and I know a lot of other organizations think about renewable electricity this way as well, when you're looking at an electricity policy about generation, if that policy is getting new renewables built, it is actually doing something meaningful from a climate standpoint. If it is not getting new renewables built in a global sense, it's not actually really changing anything from a climate standpoint. And so our interest is getting a lot more than that 10% requirement for newly constructed renewable electricity. So just a little bit more on that kind of concept of requirements for new renewables. This is a slide that I'm borrowing from just credit where credit's due, Renewable Energy Vermont. Looking at the renewable electricity requirements, the renewable portfolio standards of all the different New England states. The sort of shaded bars you can see here that are a little bit lighter in color are the requirements for total renewables, but the really important piece is this dark green bar in every state. That's the requirement for new renewables. The exact requirements, like what dates are involved and all of that, are different in the different states. But this is relatively apples to apples. And as you can see, Vermont really has the lowest requirement in our region for new renewables, and that needs to change. Before I get into exactly how we want to see that change, I also wanted to share this graph because it really illustrates how some of the other really important pieces of shifting to renewables beyond the climate benefits and climate imperative. This is a chart that looks at the projections for the cost of electricity going forward in the ISO New England market, basically the grid in New England. And the blue line here is the sort of power on the market. It essentially, gas generation. If you're using more electricity next year than this year, this is what you'd be going to unless you're getting something else new built. And as you can see, there are projections for very expensive power from gas generation going forward. Basically the flat line down there is Vermont Solar built, it's a larger solar farm for Vermont, but really, fairly modest in the scheme of things. And as you can see, a long-term contract for solar is going to be a lot more price stable than new fossil fuel generation. And, in most cases, at most times of the year, much lower in price. So as much as, we really need to make this happen from a climate standpoint, there are also really important financial reasons relating to the, keeping Vermont's rates low and stable, that we want more long-term renewable contracts than we have today. And that's only going to be more true as we see the, increased tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act roll out. All right, this is my last slide, and this really gets into the meat of what we're looking to do in terms of updating and overhauling the Renewable Energy Standard. So that tier 2 piece, the new renewables in Vermont, we're pushing to see that increased from that 10% by 2032 to 20% by 2030 and 30% by 2035. That's an aggressive pace, but it's doable given the sort of workforce constraints and the realities of Vermont's grid. And if we do that, I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act a few minutes ago, we could see $500 million to $1 billion in additional federal tax credits flowing into Vermont's economy to get those renewables built. That is critical. That's an enormous benefit to Vermont's economy. Number 2, we want to see a new tier added for new renewable energy that could be in Vermont, could be elsewhere in New England, but doesn't necessarily have to be at that smaller size. So this could be new wind in Vermont, it could be new larger solar, it could be new offshore, wind off the coast of New England, but seeing that at 30% by 2035 as well. And if you add those two up, you're talking about a requirement for not 10%, but 60% newly built renewables in Vermont or elsewhere in New England, wind and solar. And that is exactly what we should be doing if we care about the climate crisis. This 10% is not remotely close to enough. And then rounding out the electricity portfolio in 2035 under this construct would be 40% requirement for existing renewable energy, getting to a total of 100% renewables by 2030. The last couple of things that I wanted to mention, one, Vermont can and must do much better in terms of providing real tangible access to renewables for low and moderate income Vermonters and other historically marginalized or disadvantaged communities. Right now, policies like net metering in Vermont don't really provide a meaningful outlet for renters or low income Vermonters to actually access that electricity. That's starting to change, partly due to some appropriations from the state. And that's really encouraging, but as we look to overhaul the Renewable Energy Standard, we really should be doing much better on that front as well. And then lastly, you might hear the term, as we go through legislative session, procurement programs sort of tossed around. That's essentially, net metering, the standard offer, programs you may have heard of that are a little bit more specific about how and when and where and by who this renewable electricity is going to be built. We believe that it's important that those policies like net metering and the standard offer are also expanded and revised as we're overhauling the renewable electricity standard to make sure that we have real clarity about how renewables are actually going to get built on the ground here in Vermont, that we have a diversity of sources like wind and solar, and again, that all Vermonters, including low and moderate income Vermonters, can really benefit from that construction of renewables in a direct way. So that's the whirlwind tour through what we're looking to see in our renewable electricity standard. I will say this is a policy that we are going to be pushing and expect may well take the full biennium. We are, however, of course, looking to get it started as quickly as we can. And thanks for the questions in the chat. Again, that's something that we will get to at the end.
Yes, perfect. Great questions. Keep them coming. Again, we'll get to as many as we can in just a few minutes. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Rob Kidd with the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club, and I'm gonna actually just share my quick little slides here just to kind of give a quick little overview of what's happening on the transportation front. For those who don't know it, I am the Vermont Sierra Club Conservation Program Manager and the one staff person for the Vermont Sierra Club. However, I have a team of volunteers who actively look at policy and are actively engaged with designing what we're advocating for. I showed this opening slide up here just to kind of give a broad overview of just the nature of transportation advocacy as an environmentalist. First off, climate change is very key to the point. Is around 40% of our carbon emissions come from the transportation sector. So hence, the Sierra Club started working on encouraging driving electric. And if you see that little sign there, but then also if you see the kind of little picture with the State House, we've been doing events to kind of promote the availability of electric vehicles, and sometimes the best advocates for an electric vehicle are those who actually drive them. So that was one of those events we did at the State House a number of years ago. But also, it's really important not just to electrify our personal vehicles, to expand transit options. You see the electric bus that started out in Burlington. It's now, I think there's 4 of them on Green Mountain Transit. And then there's expanding options, and there's going to be more coming to the state of Vermont, thanks to the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. Then also, I threw in that little graphic of the bicycles, because as well, we have to make our roads safe for pedestrians and bicyclists. It's just not, our roads aren't just be run by cars. We need to actually have roads that are accessible to everybody, all users, and not just being dependent on individualized cars. But back to the individualized cars, to give some progress, we were very successful this year, thanks to the Agency of Natural Resources team, for implementing the rules for the advanced clean car rules and advanced clean truck rules. In effect, by 2035, all new vehicles in the state of Vermont will be electric. So it's a great path to move forward where we can do, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. We need to do a lot more in these other areas. So I just want to kind of recap. Is last year we had nearly $40 million that directly went to EV incentives or EV charging supply, which featured in multifamily unit dwellings. We also made some investments in microtransit and bike and pedestrian investments. Thankfully, because of the federal money that was coming in, we've been able to pay for it. Now, how we're going to do that in the future is another story, which we'll talk about in a second. As well, the advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks rules adopted, and we really greatly appreciated that. So starting in 2026, we'll have even more EVs available, and it's a requirement from the manufacturers to produce more EVs and have better control of batteries. Then also, just kind of like, we are not just walking in the climate advocacy world alone. We also have the Vermont Climate Council, who is trying to look into different things about the cap and investment or a performance standard of how Vermont can go forward even more aggressively. Because like you said, 40% of our carbon emissions come from the transportation sector. So it's not just one policy. It's all the above. We have to kind of figure out how we can disincentivize fossil fuel usage while we're incentivizing alternative methods. So pay attention to the Climate Council. So as we go into the 2023 legislative session, the Transportation Committee generally produces 2 bills a year. Generally, the transportation bill passes out of the House, which includes all the financial investments, and some policies as well. And we're hoping that we can see this year increase in funding in what's known as the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grants. Those grants have been responsible for supporting the microtransit project in Mount Pillier, my ride, but then all the other communities that are implementing some type of pilot in the next couple of years. Our advocacy has added additional money to that even though some folks in the agency of transportation will say we don't need more money, it's something we really do need to push for, and to push for new and innovative transportation ideas, because it's not just about personalized cars. Then also the bike and pedestrian programs. There's a lot of federal money that comes out to these different programs, but a lot of communities don't know how to access it or don't even know about this. So we want to see more money coming into that, because basically if people can bike to work or bike with 3 miles or 4 miles to the bus, it would make things so much easier where people don't have to be dependent on a particular car to get places. As well, e-bike incentives, we were able to, the last 2 transportation budgets put $50,000 into the budget for e-bike incentives. And they finally launched the program this summer, and the program, the money in that went so quickly that I think the program only existed for a month. We'd like to see more money going into that, because with our roads and hills and our aging population, an e-bike is a very good option for those who just want to go to the grocery store to get a quick gallon of milk or something, or just go to the office quickly without having to sweat up during the hot summer nights, hot summer days. And we want to see, make sure that EV charging is expanded at multifamily dwellings and workplaces. But just want to, while I reference this particular thing, there's a lot of programs that we need to kind of look at and making sure that agency of transportation is held accountable. Currently, the agency will present very good workings and reports and saying that they're doing a lot, but sometimes we've been asking for these programs for a number of years and they're finally getting to it. And we want to make sure that they're doing things in a timely fashion, because we don't have much time to wait to act on climate change. We need to act now. So we want to make sure that their agency is looking at funding these programs in the long term and how we're going to be accountable for it and how we're going to do it in the future. So if you look in, I know there's going to be some proposals about looking into some type of cap and invest program, such as what was the Transportation Climate Initiative, restoring that in Vermont. Also the idea of a vehicle efficiency price adjustment program. How can we incentivize purchasing of highly efficient vehicles and disincentivizing the gas guzzling vehicles? And the same hand is, how do we disincentivize the super users, people who are using a lot more gas than the common citizen? We have to look into all those different aspects of our transportation policy. But as I said, also these programs there's a lot more policy that we have to look into, like complete streets and bike and pedestrian investments. There was a clause added in last year's transportation bill that will look at the Vermont State road standards. I know the Agency of Transportation is looking into that, how we're going to move forward with that. So these policies can be kind of done through what's known as the miscellaneous DMV bill, where some of these ideas are addressed even in a little bit more detail, because the way the Transportation Committee operates, it deals with a lot of budget stuff. So we're trying to kind of get this conversation moving forward in a way that makes sense for all of Vermonters, not just for a select few. But I want to just actually step it up 1 second here. Is, as Lauren mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of new transportation committee. There's a lot of new committee leaders and new members. And I want to stress on the importance of these folks. The House Transportation Committee, with the new chair, is Sarah Kofi out of Guilford, Wichita of Pittsburgh, Timmy Corcoran of Bennington, John Bartholomew of Heartland is returning. Molly Burke of Brattleboro is returning. Scott Campbell of St. Johnsbury. I apologize, I don't know the names of Miss Dodge of Essex. They were Kate Laley of Shelburne, Patty McCoy of Pulteney, and I think Phil Poach of Heinsberg, and Matt Walker of Swanton. As the Transportation Committee doesn't take as much testimony as some other committees because they're doing a lot of budget, it's really important for many of our members and our activists to reach out to these folks and tell them your ideas and connect with them, because they're like the Transportation Committee will only take a testimony on a particular issue, a very limited capacity, because they're dealing with a huge multi-million-dollar budget that they have to address. So I just want to stress that and make sure everybody continues to do that. I am also going to share in the chat in a moment a link to a survey that the Sierra Club is producing. I request if you all can fill that out to help formulate some ideas, because I want to push this into the legislative sphere where we're getting more public engagement around the transportation issues and not just relying on agency personnel to present to the transportation leaders. So, and I'll take questions at the end when Lauren facilitates.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And thank you all again for the great conversation happening in the chat. And now I'm going to turn it over to Debbie New and Jim Dumont to talk about ratepayer protection and networked geothermal.
Okay, great. Jim and I are going to share this time. I just want to make sure you can see my screen. I'm going to try to talk and advance slides at the same time. We're going to be talking about a bill that's in the House, and we expect an identical Senate version of the bill. And this new bill is a way of achieving an equitable, effective energy transition in Vermont. It's called the Ratepayer Protection and Thermal Energy Networks Act, and it's got 3 provisions. All of these are known and demonstrated solutions. The first is to help Vermonters afford their electric bills by expanding electric ratepayer protection to all low and moderate income Vermonters. The second adds a proven and important solution to our energy choices in the state by creating a pathway for geothermal and other kinds of thermal energy networks. Finally, the bill moves Vermont away from combusting fuels. We have to stop burning things. So this bill also prohibits gas expansion into new service territories. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim to talk about the first provision, but all of these together can accelerate Vermont's transition to clean energy equitably and effectively. So the first part is about helping Vermonters afford their electricity bills.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. The first question is why? Why are we looking at ratepayer protection? The answer is we want to incentivize low and moderate income Vermonters to choose electric for reasons we all know, and we need to make these electric bills fair and affordable. Right now, Vermont's ratepayer protection system lags behind the rest of New England, which we'll discuss in an upcoming slide. So here's a summary of Vermont's current ratepayer protection statute and system. Right now, it's only Green Mountain Power. No other utility has the system, has a program. It's a small benefit. According to Green Mountain Power, the average benefit is a $25 per month reduction in the electric bill. The application process is pretty involved, and it requires a new application every year. The Department of Public Service commissioned a study of this program about 2 years ago, and the study found that only about 1/4 of eligible low-income customers have signed up. And it's pretty clear why. It's because the benefit is small, the application process is involved, and we need to change that. If you look at the programs in other New England states and the rest of the country, our energy assistance program is pretty inadequate. And it's embarrassing to say this, but we lag behind even Ohio and New Hampshire. Need I say anything more? And as we note at the bottom of this slide, the same study found that the lowest income Vermonters sometimes pay as much as 51% of their disposable income on energy, while upper income Vermont households pay about 3%. So if we're going to encourage people to electrify their homes, we need to make it affordable and fair. So next slide. This is how we propose to do it. The bill would require the PUC to adopt a tiered discount program. The tiered discount is designed to keep energy costs down to about 6% of household income. That's what is generally across the country deemed to be an affordable level of spending on home energy. The second part of the change would be to facilitate the application process, whether by automatic enrollment or what's known as self-certification. For example, if you qualify for LIHEAP or 3 Squares Vermont, you should be able to just check a box and qualify without going through a multi-page application process that's sent to a state agency to review. We think it's going to be necessary that this program be a statewide program and not just Green Mountain Power. It's not fair to have only some Vermonters have this opportunity. If it's going to be effective and fair, every Vermont ratepayer needs to be able to apply if you're low income or moderate income. The experts who've looked at this so far at the National Consumer Law Center have roughly estimated that the bill impact on other ratepayers would be small, $1 or $2 a month. And the National Consumer Law Center has been working with us on drafting the bill, and they provided great volunteer service to us, and we've really followed their lead on how to write this.
So the next part of the bill is the thermal energy networks part that adds a proven solution to our energy choices in Vermont. So first, we need to talk about what thermal energy networks are and make sure we're all talking about the same thing. These are network systems that use geothermal or other thermal energy to provide heating and cooling from non-combusting sources. This can come from underground, from excess heating or cooling that comes from the buildings themselves, or from wastewater systems and other sources. These are not district steam systems that come from combusting something like biomass. This technology has been around for a long time and is working all over the world. It's proven to reduce emissions dramatically and lower energy costs significantly. It's also all of these other things. It's safe because nothing is burned. It's healthy because there is no indoor air pollution. It's also reliable and resilient and secure because much of the infrastructure is underground and comes from constant sources of temperature. So you're probably familiar with geothermal for a single home. This is already possible in Vermont. When you turn on your heat, a ground source heat pump inside delivers warm air and extracts cold air to store underground. When you need cooling, the process reverses. That same heat pump delivers cold air and extracts heat from your home, returning it to the earth. That heating or cooling comes from underground, where the earth is a constant temperature. Water-filled pipes bring that temperature to your heat pump, where it's concentrated into hot or cold air to keep you comfortable in summer or winter. So now that we all are sure that we know what we're talking about, we're going to talk about a network system, which is even more efficient. Buildings are connected to those same vertical wells, but they're also linked by horizontal pipes that form closed loops that are not only exchanging temperature with the earth, but also sharing it between buildings. Homes and large buildings often have different thermal needs at different times, so excess heating or cooling can be exchanged efficiently between them. And it's important to note that thermal energy networks can substantially reduce electricity use, dramatically lowering peak loads and contributing to keeping electricity costs down. Other states have authorized utilities to add thermal energy networks, like in New York, where there are 15 projects in process. And to our south in Framingham, Massachusetts, you can see the bird's eye view on the right. That system includes affordable housing, a fire station, and a couple of elementary schools. We can bring this solution to Vermont, where we can also prioritize affordable housing, and we can give fossil fuel workers the opportunity to use their existing skills and have well-paying jobs. So this bill authorizes thermal energy network utilities. We started with the successful New York bill called the Thermal Energy Network and Jobs Act, which got a unanimous vote in the New York Senate just this past year and was supported equally by utilities, labor, and environmental and climate leaders. The Vermont bill allows existing utilities, gas or electric utilities and electric co-ops, and it allows businesses like fuel companies that are looking for new opportunities, or co-ops, nonprofits, municipalities, and other community-based organizations to become thermal energy network utilities. So by allowing all of these entities to function as thermal energy utilities, they can access the capital that's needed to install the infrastructure, including low-interest federal loans. They can recover the upfront cost through rates, and they can also receive a return on the investment. The PUC's role here is to prove approve of the entity and the rates. VGS is already working on developing a thermal energy network business unit. And with passage of this bill, VGS can function as that kind of utility, but they can also provide services, construction help, or other services to these other entities, making it easier to implement and scale more of these systems. So we see this provision as a fitting companion to the ratepayer protection part of the bill. It provides low-cost energy to Vermonters, and based on conversations we've had with lots of different kinds of people, is an idea that everyone can support. And now, Jim, you want to talk about moving away from combusting fuels?
Sure. So if you look at Vermont Gas's 2021 Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, Vermont Gas stated the obvious, which was it's no longer appropriate to think about expanding natural gas transmission lines. Their 21 Integrated Resource Plan, which was approved by the PUC, contains a statement that Vermont Gas has no plans to expand its transmission line and enter a new service territory. Instead, they're going to focus on filling in within their existing service territory. And that's all positive news that Vermont Gas has recognized that, and we commend them for that. We commend their leadership for that. However, Vermont Gas is owned by Energy, and the leadership of Vermont Gas is appointed or reappointed or not appointed every year. We need this commitment in statute. As many of you know, the latest VGS project was the Addison Natural Gas Project at a cost of over $180 million to serve, believe it or not, only 3,000 customers. There are less expensive solutions that are safer, more equitable, and can dramatically reduce emissions. So this is a part of the package, taking the commitment from VGS's IRP and putting into statute that would state no more no more gas transmission line expansions.
So this bill is a package of known and demonstrated solutions. It introduces an effective statewide electric bill assistance program. It provides a way to implement and scale geothermal and other thermal energy systems, and it helps gas expansion across the state. Overall, the Ratepayer Protection and Thermal Energy Networks Act protects low and moderate income households, benefits all Vermonters by creating more in-state clean energy choices, and makes mandated climate goals more reachable in a fair and just way. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance if you want to learn more about thermal energy networks. And I'll also put my email in case you want to discuss this bill with Jim and with me. We'd be delighted to do that. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you both. And we've been trying to capture questions and do some lumping. Maybe while we have the ratepayer protection and geothermal fresh in people's minds from you just wrapping up, could you talk a little bit? There were some questions about the cost effectiveness of geothermal, and have there been like ROI studies or rate case studies done, that kind of thing? Could you just speak a little bit more to kind of the costs and how this might play out in Vermont?
Absolutely. So the cost of the system is the infrastructure that gets installed first. And experts across the country have put it that you're buying all of your fuel up front. It's that one energy solution where you're paying for everything in advance. And then the monthly bills are incredibly low. So the good news is that the Framingham project that I mentioned is going to have open, transparent data. They're doing a deep study with Department of Energy funding, and we'll know a lot about costs as we watch that system evolve. The other thing is that VGS is doing a feasibility study right now that will include both the physical, geological parts of a project, but also looking at the costs and how the billing, how the financing would work. The Energy Action Network Action Team that's focused on network geothermal energy is also, we have the Vermont Bond Bank and VITA and other people involved who are looking closely at the financing. So one reason why I don't know a lot about specific costs on specific projects is because they're variable, but we know they're all low. A lot of the projects that are in the ground are run by private developers who are not willing to share their costs. So we hope to have some more specifics to share soon. There's a case study coming from Colorado Mesa University very soon, where they have been using the system for 12 years and never once used their gas backup. So that case study will also have cost information.
Thank you. And just following up, a couple quick questions came in, and then we'll get into some of the other topics. Some of them are being answered about kind of sponsors and where we might see this. So some of these are good kind of chat answer questions. So thank you for getting some of that info in, Jim. And one question was, is there federal funding? Is this part of the Inflation Reduction Act or other kind of grant programs? Is this something being incentivized by the federal government?
Yes, it's being incentivized heavily, and we hope for more incentives very soon. The IRA, you can get up to 40% reduction on the whole system. You get 30% and then an extra 10% for domestic manufacture. And the good news is that a lot of the parts of these systems are manufactured in the United States. So those are incentives. The Department of Energy has put out an application for a grant. VGS has applied for that grant. That deadline is passed, so that funding for now is gone, but we're hoping there'll be future grants. So it's possible VGS will be able to access that money. And then there are also Department of Energy loans, the low interest loans that I mentioned earlier. And those are in the billions of dollars that are available from the Loan Program Office. So we're meeting with our congressional delegation soon to talk about accessing that.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn to Chase. And I'm just going to kind of combine a couple questions that came in and just ask you, Chase, could you talk a little bit more about kind of how the various types of heating would be covered under this bill? There were specific questions, for example, about biofuels and wood heating. So if you could just talk a little bit more about how those would be addressed in the current iteration of affordable heat, and like what goals our coalition would be looking to maintain in any future iterations of the bill.
Sure, happy to. Thanks for the questions. So one of the big improvements that we see in this year's version of the bill compared to last year's version of a similar bill called the Clean Heat Standard is that this year's bill explicitly names many really beneficial things that would be eligible for clean heat credits that were not explicitly named in last year's version of the bill. So, for example, geothermal heating systems, whether at a sort of a larger district or at a smaller microgrid or home level, are all explicitly named now, which is a tremendously beneficial thing. So other things too, like solar hot water heating systems, controlled electric water heating systems, and many other things have been added. So at first blush, that's sort of one really important change that's been made, incentivizing the clean thermal options that we really would like to see. How wood and really any other heating source would be measured, whether it be electric or biofuel, is the Public Utility Commission would create a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions accounting measure, and it would take a look at the greenhouse gas emissions that a building was emitting today with its current heating systems, which are most likely fossil fuel, and then it would look at the greenhouse gas emissions that would be emitted after that building implements a change, whether implementing cold climate heat pumps or hot water heater, an electric hot water heater, or geothermal, or adding some sort of an efficient wood heating system. And if there was a greenhouse gas emissions benefit, like if you took the old emissions and the new emissions and you subtracted the two, and we had a greenhouse gas emissions savings, then that system would get some clean heat credits. And so that system would apply towards anything that could potentially qualify, including things like wood. And so, you know, truly efficient wood heating systems, if they, on a life cycle basis, do reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then they could qualify. And it would really all boil down to, do they really reduce greenhouse gas emissions? That being the most important policy outcome we're hoping to get. You know, it's a good thing that would be the measure that we would then use. So that addresses, I think, most of the concerns there or questions there. Let me just add, I guess, one other piece is that the current version of the Affordable Heat Act that that we're looking at this year, it also makes some meaningful changes in the field of strengthening greenhouse gas emissions accounting. And so that too, you know, that's an important change that I think is relevant to taking a look at the real policy goals of this piece of legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Chase. And I'm going to ask Ben a few questions. We got a bunch about the Renewable Energy Standard. So just a couple kind of clarifying things to start, Ben. There was some confusion about the 100% renewable goal and I think how Hydro-Quebec fits into that. So if you could speak a little bit about, you know, the goals, reiterate the 100% compared to the in-state renewable goals, how HQ will fit into that under the proposal, maybe under status quo and under the proposal, and then just speak to which legislative proposals are going to be dealing with this. Someone was asking for kind of more of those specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the clarifying question. I think it was Linda on the, you know, is it 100% by 2030? Is it by 2035? That was definitely an oversight on my part. Our intent is for it to be 100% by 2030. I referenced the 2035 date because that, in our sort of construct that we're going to be pursuing, is when the requirement for new renewables in Vermont and in Vermont or elsewhere in New England would peak at that 30% level. So the idea essentially is you get to 100% by 2030 using a higher percentage of existing renewables, and then we slowly would have, you know, less as a percentage of our total electricity mix existing renewables as we get more and more new renewables. So that you know, that sort of 30% new in-state, 30% new in New England, 40% existing would be the 2035 mix, but you'd see sort of more existing as a percentage prior to that date. On Hydro-Quebec, so currently the way that's treated is as any other renewable. So when I was talking about tier 1, the 75%, or rather the 65% of that 75% total renewable requirement, that can come from any renewable deliverable to New England, in-state, out-of-state, large, small, old, new. And so a lot of that is currently met, as I mentioned, by large hydro. Some of that is met by contracts with large hydroelectric facilities for both the power and the RECs. And some of it's met with just the RECs from those large hydro resources. There's two things that would change over time in this sort of new construct if we're successful, of course. One, and most importantly, is as we ramp up the requirements for new renewables, the sort of opening for anything else, including but not limited to Hydro-Quebec, would be smaller and smaller over time, with that ceiling of 40% being in place by 2035. That is a bit more than Hydro-Quebec provides to Vermont right now, but would provide a hard ceiling. I certainly would expect that there would be some diversity of resources in there. It wouldn't be all HQ. The other thing that's important to understand that we are pushing for is that you would also the electric utilities wouldn't be allowed to meet that existing renewables requirement with RECs from large hydro or RECs from resources outside of New England generally. So, you know, there's a sort of a lot of nuance and complication about the markets, renewable energy credits in New England and around the region, but that is something that we would like to phase out in Vermont. And then in terms of the, you know, where is this going to show up in the legislature? Our best guess is that it would initially be introduced in the new Environment and Energy Committee in the House, though it's certainly, you know, we've heard a lot of interest in both the House and the Senate in this this kind of concept of overhauling the Renewable Energy Standard. So it could wind up being introduced both there and in the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. That's a little bit up in the air. And I should say that's not unusual in the first year of a biennium, especially this year with, as Lauren said, you know, a third of the House and a third of the Senate being new members, that, you know, things are just a little bit slower to get going in the first year of a biennium than they are in the second year. And so, you know, the fact that the bill hasn't been introduced just yet is not terribly surprising at this point.
Thank you, Ben. A couple more on the renewable energy front. There was a question about small nuclear, which I'm going to put to Ben, knowing VPIRG's worked a lot on nuclear. Is that something that is getting discussion in Vermont? Is that part of any proposal, or can you speak to that?
It's certainly not something that we were proposing or supporting. You know, it's something that we've heard there's interest in, you know, that the Scott administration might want to see nuclear play some role, you know, some increased role in our electric mix in the future. That's not something that we'd support. That's a sort of a whole other set of questions related to that. But aside from the waste issue, I just mentioned briefly that in the United States, the recent experiences with constructing new nuclear plants have been just wildly expensive, way over their already very high budgets. So that's, for a variety of reasons, not something that we would look to see in this in Vermont's electric mix, and not something that would be included in the construct that I was describing.
Thank you. And just continuing on, a couple more. There were a lot of renewable energy related questions. Could you talk a little bit about how tax credits versus tax prebates might impact? There was a question about like the Vermont economy or cash flow in Vermont, and maybe just talk a little bit more about kind of timeline and how we're seeing the potential impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. I know you touched on it in your presentation, but just a little more on that.
Yeah, and that's really important for really all of what we're talking about in one way or another. So the Inflation Reduction Act, again, sort of a whole other webinar. I will drop in the chat in a minute a couple of resources that can be helpful for folks who are just to look and understand what was in there. There was obviously a lot. But just so folks know, there are tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act that would apply to the construction of renewable electricity sources, to the installation of pretty much everything that we've been talking about: heat pumps, geothermal, weatherization, even electrical upgrades if they're sort of required to in order to install those kinds of systems in your home, like upgrading your electricity panel even has a tax credit under this. Those tax credits were increased in the cases that they already existed, and were extended out about a decade. So that's all really good news. It's not a panacea, and there, as one of the questions sort of alluded to, or I imagine this is what you're getting at, the fact that they're tax credits in most cases, which would only be available if you, one, had tax appetite, to use the technical term, but basically, you know, if you earn enough money that you can get the tax rebate, the tax credit. And then, of course, you have to be able to, you know, sort of front the money, either out of your own bank account or by getting financing, and then you get the tax credit down the road when the when you file taxes the following year. And that, both of those pieces of how tax credits work are real problems for low and moderate income Americans from any corner of the country. So, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that there are good financing options available so that, lower or moderate income Vermonters can actually are much more likely to be able to take advantage of those credits. But yeah, a lot of the way that the federal government does energy policy and tax credits is not great from an equity standpoint. Unfortunately, we can do some in Vermont to improve that, but there's only so much we can do, unfortunately. I will note that some of those tax credits, for electric vehicles or used electric vehicles in a year or two, I think it's starting in 2024, are required to be available at the time of purchase. So that's a good step in the right direction, but you don't see that with other things like credits for solar, heat pumps, et cetera, which is unfortunate. I also did want to just briefly mention that there's an additional pot of about $60 million coming to the state that would actually be, grants for low and moderate income Vermonters to engage in electrification and weatherization. And so that's good. That's a limited pot of money, even though it is $60 million, but that doesn't have the same problems that I described with the tax credits. Lauren, was there another question in there that I missed?
Just, it seems like people are still wondering about the timeline, which I think you've touched on a little, but could you just talk about like when we'd expect these to be available and or when we'll know better?
Oh, the tax credits, not the bills.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the tax credits are available as of 8 days ago, January 1st, 2023. The higher tax credits and the broader, on a broader suite of things are all available. If you want to call it contractor today and they install in, a few weeks or a few months, that you would get a tax credit for that install. The other pot of money that I mentioned, the $60 million, my best guess, although I don't think we know with certainty, is that those grants would start to become available in 2024 and would need to be expended over the next handful of years. But they're not, because the state is sort of receiving that money and then needs to set up new programs with it, they are not available right away. That's also true of the $100+ million that the state of Vermont put into weatherization and electrification incentives for low and moderate income Vermonters. Those are also programs largely that are getting stood up, although some in particular in the weatherization space already had funding and so are available now.
Thank you for that. All right, one more for you, Ben, and then I'm going to move to some other panelists. And thank you all again for all the great conversation going on in the chat. One other, there were some questions about batteries and battery backup systems and storage. Could you just speak a little bit more to how we'd anticipate that coming up in the legislature this year?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's a really important topic. And I'd also add to that, the upgrading the Vermont electric grid, because as we electrify, we're going to need, more capacity on that grid. We can use the grid that we already have better and more efficiently and more effectively, but we're going to need to continue to build it out over the coming decades. So energy storage is one of those things that has a much sort of broader and better tax credit available to it, which is going to be great for us and everyone else trying to deploy battery storage and other energy storage technologies. There's already a lot sort of going on in Vermont on that front, largely driven by the electric utilities, although it also is, somewhat encouraged by some provisions in the Renewable Electricity Standard. I will also just mention, not in any detail because we're still working on it, but we have a real interest in requiring a lot more activity and sort of the build out of energy storage in Vermont, especially now that that tax credit is available from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's something that we'll be pursuing as well. We're not sort of as far along in developing that initiative, and so it wasn't part of this presentation today, but certainly stay tuned. And if that's something that you're interested in, there will be ample opportunity for you to advocate for it in the coming months and years.
Thanks, Ben. All right, turning to Rob, there were not as many transportation questions, but there were some comments and like programs mentioned. And I was hoping, Rob, that you could speak a little bit more about programs, specifically helping lower income Vermonters get around. I know there was some conversation about transit, mileage smart, and so on. So if you could just dig in a little bit more on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. First off, to follow up on what Ben had just referenced about tax credits. When Vermont, we created the incentive programs for EVs, we particularly made it as a point of sale, not a tax credit, because of that whole question about lower income Vermonters don't have a tax liability. So how are they going to get a benefit from it? So that's why we actually got those programs created. But also directly relating, actually, I see Representative Mary Sullivan's on here. She was really big into pushing and creating an incentive program. So we thank Mary from her term from a few years ago. She's no longer a representative, but we also created some programs that are very encouraging to help people. Particularly is the Mileage Smart program, which allows Vermonters to access lower income, high efficiency vehicles and electric. And are stackable with other incentives. Then also Replace Your Ride, which allows people to trade in their older vehicle that's highly inefficient to a newer efficient vehicle that can even be changed for not just a car, but it can be used for a bus pass. Well, actually, since a bus pass, or it could be used for an e-bike. So there's other programs out there specifically targeting equity questions. So if you know of anybody who's looking for an EV, I know there's some people on here who benefited from the Mileage Smart program, and that's a really good option for those who can't. And thanks, Greta, for throwing it in the chat. By 2035, there was a question just thrown in there about new vehicles. All new vehicles by 2035 will be electric. And then also, just kind of related to the equity question, this is something that people don't really talk about, is for the last couple of years, we've had fare-free transit for all of Vermont. And now, but Green Mountain Transit is talking about removing that because there's some other operational costs. So it's something we're going to have to look into even further. But that's generally, we have to kind of look on to make sure how people can get to their places of work, how they can feed for their families. But then if we're transitioning to electric, that's why the programs of workplace charging and multi-unit dwelling charging is very important for us to succeed on.
Thank you, Rob. And if Jim is still here, I was going to ask him one question. There was a question asked about, oh, sorry, let me just scroll to it. Any kind of, the person had posed it as requirements or grant programs, or, what are you, is there anything that you're thinking of that pairs with the Ratepayer Protection Act in terms of how we're helping make sure that people are able to have efficient and clean homes at low and moderate income? So just any thoughts on how this program might work with other programs, or, just trying to help people transition to better, more efficient homes?
Great question. From everything I've learned listening to people like Chase and others at meetings I've been at for the last 6 months, that's a really tough nut to crack. Getting the weatherization done. There's such a bottleneck in the workforce. So we're not, in this bill, we're not proposing to condition receipt of ratepayer benefits on getting your home weatherized. It needs to be done, but we're not linking them in the bill.
Thank you. All right, we have just a few minutes left. I'm thinking of going around to each of our panelists, and I'll do it in the order you spoke so that you can mentally prepare. And if you could just wrap us up with any just kind of last thoughts, having seen the chat, if there's anything that seems like a lingering question or lingering point you want to make for the area that you covered, and then any recommendations of how folks can get involved in that issue and or stay in touch to kind of keep engaged. So Chase, I will have you go first.
Thanks, Lauren. I think based on what I saw in the chat, and apologies if I missed anything, there were a couple of lingering questions around combustion in the Affordable Heat Act and sort of renewables in the Affordable Heat Act. And so I just wanted to note that the Affordable Heat Act is different from the Renewable Energy Standard in that it doesn't award credits based on whether or not something is renewable, right? If the definition of renewable isn't what the Affordable Heat Act looks at or really cares about. What the Affordable Heat Act looks at and cares about is whether a heating system would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's the core question that the bill posits, and it's the way the bill sort of operates. So if a thermal device reduces greenhouse gas emissions, then it could qualify. And most likely those things will end up being sort of renewable, but not necessarily, because some things that are renewable, in fact, produce greenhouse gas emissions. And so those types of renewables that would produce more greenhouse gas emissions than the thing they're replacing wouldn't be eligible. And so it's an important distinction to make, I think, and hopefully that helps clear up some of those questions.
Thanks, Chase. And any thoughts on how people can stay engaged, updated, and involved in the Affordable Heat Act?
The folks on this call you've heard speak would be more than happy to connect with folks. Talking to your local legislators, of course, is another great way to do it. Lauren and the folks over at VNRC do the climate dispatch. If y'all aren't, already subscribed to that, I would suggest you do that. As far as, reaching out to me personally, please always feel free.
Thank you. And Ben, any wrap up on REDS?
Yeah, absolutely. There were a couple of questions that were sort of referencing home renewables, rooftop solar, backyard solar community renewables, how they fit in. So I'd say a couple of things on that. One, from our perspective, the most resilient grid is going to be a diverse grid that goes for technology, not over relying on any one source, whether it's hydro or wind or solar or anything else. And two, diverse in terms of size and location, so that we're not, stuck in the sort of old way of thinking in terms of the grid, where you have a handful of very large generators that are centrally located, and then lines that are going from here to there. What we're looking for is a grid that has both energy generation from renewables, of course, and energy storage, really spread throughout the state, the region, and the country. And that's a grid that, all things being equal, is going to be more resilient to future climate-fueled storms, among other things. So, what does that mean for home renewables? We're interested in there still being a very robust net metering program. One perhaps that is a little bit more sort of zeroed in on the on-site renewables, with some provisions for community renewables, especially for folks who are low or moderate income and just can't go renewable at their own home, and particularly because they're renters. And that being paired with, the sort of medium or larger renewables that also have an important role to play to just, make sure that we have the total volume of electricity that we need to see. Last note there is, I think it's also important that we reduce the barriers to the construction of renewables, especially, but certainly not exclusively, rooftop or home solar. There was another question in there about that. And so, looking at, the financial or regulatory barriers that are being put in place that slow this down, either intentionally or unintentionally, is really important. And I think we can expect to see some in this Renewable Energy Standard bill, and that's certainly an issue that we'll continue to try to work on in future legislative sessions. And in terms of how to stay in the loop, I think you're going to hear a similar thing from all of us. I'd say sign up for all of our email lists as well. We all sort of have a different style of getting you information. DCV does like a great weekly recap, for instance, where VPIRG, is much more about like, there's an activity, like you need to send an email tomorrow because this urgent thing is happening. So that's, one thing that's always to the good if you're not already on our lists. And then, stay tuned on those lists for a lot more activity that you can engage in, petitions you can sign, days at the State House you can actually show up for as we're navigating this new, world where in-person does sort of work again. We're definitely going to be doing that sort of thing this session as well. So, and thank you so much for being here. This is, you're taking an hour and a half out of your day. That is a big deal, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. I did just want to acknowledge before turning it over to Rob, a great question about workforce and supply chains. Certainly big issues. There is work happening in the legislature looking at programs and how to address it, but it is definitely something we're going to have to be working at and keeping an eye on how it impacts, how we're able to implement this work. And we'll keep, build more of that update into future iterations of these webinars. Rob, any last thoughts on transportation? And no need to be redundant, but if there's anything to add on people staying engaged in transportation, let us all know.
Yeah, so I just want to make this clear. There is no single magic bullet to solve this crisis we're in. All these solutions that are needed, and we all need to be actively supporting them and working for the best possible solutions to come together. So whether it's cleaning up our electric grid, or promoting electric vehicles, or making our roads safe for all users, we all have to work for all these solutions, not just one idea. So, before I shared the link to the committee members on the House Transportation Committee, please be in touch with them, contact them, give them ideas, and stay in touch with all of our organizations to act on this stuff, because it's important for us to change the debate. And make sure we honor those who've done great work, and it's a long process. So, like I remember a few years ago when Representative Mary Sullivan introduced a bill for designating electric vehicle funds to an incentive, we were given pushback because there was too much money, and so her work led us to that direction. So I want to make that it's a long game process as well. So thanks to those all who attended and all been pushing along the way.
Thank you, and love the shout outs to Representative Sullivan. So how about Jim? Could you provide any wrap up thoughts for ratepayer protection?
I think Debbie's going to handle that.
Great, thanks. Go ahead,
Sure.
Debbie.
Well, the ratepayer protection is a really important provision, and it's an easy one to pass and implement because we know it works and we know we need it now. Vermont needs to catch up with other states. Vermont can also catch up with New York on thermal energy networks. We can actually stay in the lead by allowing those systems to move forward according to the utility model in Vermont, so we can pay for them equitably and help more Vermonters access them. We know we need the solution in Vermont. We need everything. And there are national resources available to us. There's a utility coalition, an advocacy coalition, and there's an industry coalition. And there's so much support for us to figure things out, get engineers and designers and construction HVAC people into the state and figure out how we're going to do this, because it's going to look different in different places, but we can be creative. We can be in the forefront of the innovation on using geothermal and other thermal energy to help power our state and reduce our emissions from our buildings.
Thank you all so much. So we will wrap it up here. Again, just really grateful for the time, dedicating an hour and a half of your Monday to be with us. And people gave some great advice on saving the chat. There were a lot of really good resources. I know we will do the same. So feel free to reach out if you missed anything and want any follow-up. Any of us panelists would happily follow up. And Greta from the Vermont Natural Resources Council is a great resource in connecting you to what you need. Please stay involved and engaged. Again, with so many new legislators in particular, there is a lot of work to be letting people know in the State House how important climate action and these policies are, and the values and principles that we want to make sure are embedded in those policies. So thank you all for making your voices heard and joining us today to learn more, and we'll be back in touch with you soon. Take care.